Sarah Mitchell stood at the kitchen window, staring out at the vast expanse of the family farm, a land she had grown both to love and resent over the years. At 35, Sarah's life seemed settled in every way she had once thought mattered. She had a husband, a house, and a steady routine. The small town in Kentucky, where she and Tim had built their life together, was quiet and predictable, perhaps too predictable. For the most part, she kept herself busy working as a nurse at the local clinic, a job that gave her both a sense of purpose and an escape from the loneliness that crept into her marriage. Tim Mitchell, her husband, was 38, a man deeply rooted in the land he'd inherited from his parents. His life was dedicated to the farm, a sprawling 200 acres of corn and soybean fields, dotted with cattle that wandered lazily across the property. He wasn't a man of many words, but he had a quiet strength about him, the kind that Sarah had found comforting when they first met over a decade ago. Tim had grown up in the very house they now lived in, a rustic farmhouse with creaking wooden floors and the smell of earth embedded in its walls. He had spent his entire life working the land, just as his father and grandfather had before him. Farming was all he knew. They had met at a wedding, a mutual friend's ceremony in Indiana, where Sarah had grown up. She was 24 at the time, bright-eyed and full of dreams, working as a nurse's aide and imagining a future filled with adventure and excitement. Tim, already in his late 20s, had been reserved but attentive, a man who seemed so sure of who he was and what he wanted. Their courtship had been brief, and before she knew it, Sarah had moved to Kentucky, leaving behind her childhood home for the promise of love and stability. At first, everything was perfect. The farm seemed like a romantic place, full of opportunity. Sarah imagined herself helping to run things, starting a family, and living out the simple, contented life she had always believed she wanted. But as the years went by, the novelty wore off. Life on the farm was isolating, the days repetitive. Tim's quiet nature, which had once been a source of comfort, now felt like a barrier between them. He rarely spoke about his feelings, and when he did, it was always about the farm, the crops, the weather, the cattle. The intimacy they had once shared dwindled, replaced by a dull routine that left Sarah feeling more like a roommate than a wife. At 35, Sarah found herself restless, yearning for something she couldn't quite define. They had no children, something Sarah had once desperately wanted but had slowly given up on as the years passed. Tim never seemed particularly interested in starting a family, always saying they'd get to it eventually, but eventually never came. Their marriage, once filled with laughter and affection, had become a series of passing moments, empty conversations over dinner, and long stretches of silence. Sarah couldn't remember the last time Tim had touched her with any real affection. That was when Jessica entered their lives. Jessica was Tim's cousin, though they had hardly seen each other over the years. At 27, Jessica was younger, livelier, and seemingly full of the kind of energy that Sarah felt she had lost somewhere along the way. She arrived in the late spring, asking if she could stay with them for the summer while she sorted out her life. Jessica had been living in Nashville, working odd jobs after dropping out of college. She was charming in an effortless way, with her bright red hair, wide smile, and contagious laughter. At first, Sarah welcomed the company. She thought it might be nice to have someone around the house, someone to break the monotony. The first few weeks were pleasant enough. Jessica helped out on the farm, assisting Tim with small tasks and making herself useful in ways that endeared her to both of them. She seemed to bring a new energy into the house, and for a while, Sarah felt a sense of relief. Tim seemed happier too, more talkative, more engaged. They shared stories about their childhood, laughing over memories of family gatherings and holidays spent together. Sarah enjoyed the break from her usual solitude, even though there was a small, nagging feeling in the back of her mind, a sense that something wasn't quite right. It started with the way Tim looked at Jessica. At first, Sarah told herself she was imagining things. After all, Jessica was family. but she couldn't ignore the subtle changes in Tim's behavior. He seemed more attentive to Jessica, always finding reasons to be around her, to help her with something or to engage in long conversations that went on late into the evening. When they laughed together, it was the kind of laughter Sarah hadn't heard from Tim in years. Genuine, carefree, as if he had forgotten the burdens that weighed down his usual demeanor. Sarah tried to push her concerns aside, but the more she observed them, the more uneasy she became. There were little things, the way Tim's hand would linger just a moment too long on Jessica's back when he walked past her, or how Jessica's gaze would follow Tim when he wasn't looking. It was subtle, but it was there. Sarah began to feel like an outsider in her own home, as if she were watching something unfold from a distance, unable to stop it. The turning point came one evening in early summer. Tim had been working late in the fields, and Sarah was preparing dinner when Jessica came into the kitchen, glowing from the warmth of the day. They exchanged pleasantries, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Jessica was hiding something behind her usual cheerful demeanor. As they sat down to eat, Tim finally came in, his face flushed and tired but smiling. He sat next to Jessica, and they immediately fell into an easy conversation, laughing about something that had happened in the barn earlier that day. Sarah watched them, her fork hovering over her plate, her appetite gone. The way they interacted was too familiar, too comfortable. It was as if she weren't even there. And then it happened. A fleeting look that passed between them, something unspoken but undeniable. It lasted only a second, but it was enough. In that moment, Sarah knew. This wasn't just her imagination. Something was happening between them. That night, as Sarah lay in bed next to Tim, who had fallen asleep almost as soon as his head hit the pillow, she stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She replayed every interaction, every touch, every look between Tim and Jessica, and the realization settled deep in her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. The life she had built with Tim, the marriage she had tried so hard to maintain, was slipping away, and she felt powerless to stop it. Jessica's presence had disrupted the fragile balance of their marriage, exposing the cracks that had been forming for years. Sarah didn't want to believe it, but the signs were there. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice, looking down into an abyss of betrayal and heartache, but unable to turn away. The next morning, Sarah decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. She confronted Tim, her voice trembling as she asked him if there was something going on between him and Jessica. Tim, startled by the accusation, laughed it off, dismissing her concerns as ridiculous. "She's my cousin, Sarah," he said, shaking his head. "You're imagining things." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't imagining anything. She knew what she had seen, and no amount of reassurance from Tim could make her believe otherwise. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew with each passing day, poisoning every interaction, every glance, every word exchanged between them. As the summer stretched on, Sarah found herself watching them constantly, looking for more signs, more proof of the betrayal she was certain was happening right under her nose. The once welcoming home had become a prison of suspicion and jealousy, and Sarah felt trapped, unable to escape the overwhelming sense of betrayal that gnawed at her day and night. Jessica, oblivious to the growing tension, continued to insert herself into their lives, her presence like a slow-acting poison that was destroying everything Sarah had worked so hard to build. And though Sarah tried to confront Tim again, he only became more defensive, more distant, pushing her further away as he grew closer to Jessica. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Sarah could feel it in her bones, a storm brewing just over the horizon, ready to tear apart the fragile remnants of her marriage and leave nothing but destruction in its wake. The summer heat weighed heavily on the Kentucky farm, but inside the Mitchell household, it wasn't just the temperature that made the air feel thick and oppressive. Days had passed since Sarah's confrontation with Tim about Jessica, and while he had laughed off her suspicions, something had changed. Their conversations were shorter, more clipped. Tim's once rare but comforting touches had become non-existent, and his absences around the house became more frequent. He offered explanations, of course, more work to do in the fields, broken machinery to fix, errands to run. But Sarah, now hyper-aware of his every move, noticed patterns she couldn't ignore. Tim had always been a hard-working man, but lately, his late nights on the farm seemed to coincide with Jessica's mysterious disappearances from the house. Sarah found herself alone at the dinner table, more often, staring at the empty seats across from her, one meant for her husband, the other for the woman she had once welcomed into her home. It was as if Jessica and Tim had created their own secret world, and Sarah was no longer a part of it. Her suspicions intensified when she found herself constantly observing them. Small things at first, like the way Jessica lingered too long by Tim's side in the kitchen, offering to help with chores that didn't need any extra hands. Sarah noticed how Tim's eyes followed Jessica across the room, his lips curving into a smile that hadn't been directed at Sarah in years. The laughter that echoed through the house wasn't hers, but theirs. It stung, like salt rubbed into a wound. One afternoon, Sarah came home early from the clinic, tired from a long shift, and hoping for some quiet time with Tim. She hadn't told him she'd be home early. Perhaps she was testing him, part of her still clinging to the hope that this was all in her head. As she pulled up to the farmhouse, she noticed Tim's truck parked outside the barn. Curious, Sarah left her car and quietly approached the barn. She told herself it was just to say hello, to surprise him, but deep down her gut twisted with an anxious knot of suspicion. As Sarah neared the barn's entrance, she heard voices. Tim's low, familiar drawl mixed with the light, flirtatious tones of Jessica. They were laughing about something, their voices too close, too intimate. Her heart began to pound, her legs shaking with dread and fury. She peeked through the slats in the barn's wooden walls, barely daring to breathe. There they were, standing too close, their bodies almost touching as Tim handed Jessica a tool from the workbench. It wasn't the act itself that shook Sarah to her core. It was the way Jessica leaned into him, the way Tim's hand brushed her arm, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It was an intimacy that cut through Sarah like a knife. She backed away quickly, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. She hadn't confronted them, but the truth she had feared was now undeniable. Something was happening between Tim and Jessica, something that went beyond family. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's world unraveled. She became obsessed, her mind consumed with thoughts of their betrayal. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and at work her colleagues began to notice the dark circles under her eyes, her distracted demeanor. She brushed off their concerns, but the truth was she was drowning in jealousy and paranoia. Every interaction between Tim and Jessica felt like a performance meant to mock her. She found herself spying on them, inventing excuses to walk past the barn when they were working or peeking through windows when they thought they were alone. She hated herself for it, but she couldn't stop. She felt like a stranger in her own home, watching her husband grow more distant with each passing day. One evening, Sarah found herself in the hallway outside Jessica's bedroom. The door was cracked open slightly, and she could hear Jessica on the phone. Sarah held her breath and listened. "Yeah, I can't wait to get out of here," Jessica said, her voice low but clear. "It's just a matter of time. Tim's going to talk to her soon, and then we can finally leave." Sarah's heart stopped. Leave? She felt her knees buckle, the hallway spinning around her. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. They were planning something, planning to run away together. In a moment of pure panic, Sarah accidentally nudged the door with her elbow, causing it to creak loudly. Jessica instantly fell silent, and Sarah rushed back down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. She fled to the kitchen, pretending to busy herself with cleaning dishes when she heard Jessica's footsteps approaching. When Jessica appeared, her face was unreadable, but her eyes lingered on Sarah for a moment longer than necessary, as if she knew Sarah had been listening. From that point on, Sarah's paranoia intensified. She knew she was losing control, but she didn't care. Every word, Every glance between Tim and Jessica felt like confirmation of their betrayal. She would stay up late, listening for the creak of the floorboards or the sound of whispered conversations. Her mind raced with possibilities. Were they meeting in secret after she went to bed? Was Tim planning to leave her for Jessica? Was he in love with her? The questions gnawed at her, and soon, her jealousy twisted into something darker. Sarah began to fantasize about catching them in the act, about confronting them in a dramatic showdown that would force Tim to choose. She wanted them to suffer, to feel the pain they were causing her, but at the same time, a part of her was terrified of what she might do if she ever got the proof she so desperately craved. One day, Sarah decided she needed answers. She knew that Tim kept a spare phone for work, one he rarely used, but she had a feeling that if there were any evidence of his affair with Jessica, it would be there. While Tim was out in the fields, Sarah sneaked into the bedroom and found the phone hidden in his nightstand. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the messages. Most were harmless, work-related, but then she found it, a series of texts between Tim and Jessica. Her worst fears were confirmed. The messages were flirtatious at first, then quickly turned into something more intimate, more damning. They spoke of secret meetings, of longing, of their plans to leave together once the time was right. Sarah's blood ran cold as she read the final message, sent just the night before. "Soon, baby. We'll be free of all this. Free. Of her. Of their marriage." Sarah's hands clenched the phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She wanted to scream, to throw the phone across the room, to confront them both right then and there. But instead, she sat on the edge of the bed, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts as the reality of the situation sank in. She had to do something. But what? Confronting them might push Tim further away, and Jessica would surely manipulate him into leaving sooner. Sarah felt trapped, suffocated by her own helplessness. A few days later, the opportunity came, a moment when everything almost came crashing down. Sarah had planned to confront Tim in the barn that evening, to demand answers once and for all. She had rehearsed what she would say, how she would force him to admit to the affair. But as she approached the barn, her heart racing, she saw them again, standing close in the dim light, their faces inches apart. Jessica's hand rested on Tim's chest, and Tim looked at her with an intensity that Sarah had never seen him direct toward her. In that instant, all of Sarah's rehearsed words vanished. She froze, her legs refusing to move. They hadn't seen her yet, but they were only seconds away from discovering her presence. Just as Jessica leaned in closer, their heads nearly touching, Sarah's phone buzzed loudly in her pocket. The sudden noise shattered the moment. Tim and Jessica jumped apart, their eyes darting toward the barn entrance. Sarah panicked, quickly stepping back into the shadows, holding her breath as they both stood frozen. Tim glanced around, his brow furrowed, but after a few tense moments, he shrugged and returned to his conversation with Jessica. Sarah stayed hidden until they finally left, her heart pounding in her ears. She had come so close to being caught, so close to the confrontation she had both feared and desired. But now, the fear of exposure had paralyzed her. She had seen enough. She didn't need any more proof. The affair was real, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down around her. As the days dragged on, Sarah's mental state deteriorated further. She became more erratic, her paranoia leading her to act out in ways that unsettled even her. She would leave passive-aggressive notes for Tim, hinting at her knowledge of his betrayal. She sabotaged small things around the house. Tim's favorite tools would mysteriously go missing, or the tractor wouldn't start when he needed it most. She never confronted him directly, but she wanted him to know that she was watching, that she wasn't oblivious. Tim, for his part, grew more distant, avoiding Sarah whenever possible. He spent more time in the fields, more time with Jessica, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and her growing fury. One night, after a particularly tense dinner where Tim barely said a word to her, Sarah finally snapped. As he stood up to leave the table, she grabbed his arm, her voice shaking with anger. "How long are you going to keep pretending?" she demanded, her nails digging into his skin. "How long are you going to lie to me, Tim?" He yanked his arm away, his face a mask of confusion and irritation. "What the hell are you talking about, Sarah?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," she hissed. "You and Jessica. Don't think I haven't noticed. I've seen the way you look at her, the way you sneak around behind my back. You think I'm stupid?" Tim's face hardened, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer to her. "You're paranoid, Sarah. She's my cousin. You're losing it." But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. Her mind was racing, filled with images of Tim and Jessica, their whispered conversations, their secret plans. She couldn't stop herself now, couldn't stop the words from spilling out. "I found the messages, Tim. I know everything." For a moment, Tim's expression faltered, and Sarah felt a grim satisfaction wash over her. She had finally broken through his facade. But then, just as quickly, he regained his composure. "You need help, Sarah," he said coldly. "You're imagining things." And with that, he turned and walked out of the house, leaving her standing there, trembling with a mixture of rage and despair. The evening sky over the Mitchell farm was a dull, oppressive gray, clouds heavy with the threat of a summer storm. Sarah stood at the kitchen sink, her eyes fixed on the window, watching the wind stir the leaves of the old oak tree outside. Her hands were clenched tightly around the edges of the sink, knuckles white as she stared into the growing darkness. It had been days since her confrontation with Tim. Since then, the silence in the house had become unbearable. Tim barely looked at her, let alone spoke to her, and Jessica, always lingering in the background, had become a ghost, slipping in and out of rooms like she owned the place. The betrayal hung in the air, thick and suffocating, and Sarah felt like she was drowning in it. She couldn't take it anymore. The paranoia, the lies, the feeling of being trapped in her own home. Every time she saw Jessica's smug face or heard Tim's indifferent voice, her stomach twisted with rage. They were playing her for a fool, treating her like she was too blind or too weak to do anything about it. But she wasn't blind, and she wasn't weak. Sarah knew what she had to do. The plan had come to her in fragments, born from sleepless nights and feverish thoughts. At first, it had been nothing more than a vague fantasy, a way to escape the pain, to finally put an end to the torment. But as the days passed, that fantasy solidified into something darker, more dangerous. She couldn't leave, couldn't just walk away from everything she had built with Tim. But she could make sure that Jessica did. It was late afternoon when Sarah finally snapped. She had been sitting in the living room, pretending to read a book, when she heard them. Tim and Jessica were in the barn again, their voices low but unmistakable. She didn't need to hear what they were saying to know what was happening. The laughter, the intimacy, it was like a knife twisting in her gut. Her body moved on autopilot, her mind consumed by a single, burning thought. Enough. She couldn't let this go on any longer. She wouldn't. Sarah stormed into the kitchen and opened the drawer where they kept the knives. Her hand hovered over the largest one, the one she used to carve the Thanksgiving turkey each year. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, she hesitated, staring at the glinting blade. But then she heard it again, Jessica's laughter, soft and intimate, as if she was mocking Sarah even now. The sound pushed her over the edge. Gripping the knife tightly, Sarah slipped out of the house, the cool evening air hitting her face like a slap. The barn loomed ahead of her, dark and quiet except for the occasional murmur of their voices. She moved quickly, her footsteps silent on the dirt path. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her mind was eerily calm. She knew what she had to do. When Sarah reached the barn, she stopped just outside the entrance, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Her hand trembled slightly around the handle of the knife, but she forced the fear down. She couldn't afford to be afraid, not now. She stepped inside. Tim and Jessica were standing near the back of the barn, too close, their bodies angled toward each other in a way that made Sarah's blood boil. They didn't notice her at first, too engrossed in their conversation, and for a brief moment, Sarah just stood there, watching them. The knife felt heavy in her hand, its cold steel biting into her palm. When they finally saw her, the shift in the air was immediate. Tim's eyes widened in surprise, and Jessica froze, her face pale. For a long moment, no one said anything. The barn was filled with nothing but the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing, the knife gleaming ominously in her hand. "Sarah." Tim's voice was low, cautious. "What are you doing?" Sarah didn't answer. She took a step closer, her eyes locked on Jessica, who had taken a small step back, her expression one of fear and confusion. "Sarah, put the knife down," Tim said, his voice firm now, though she could hear the edge of panic creeping in. "Why?" Sarah's voice was barely more than a whisper, her eyes still fixed on Jessica. "Why should I put it down, Tim? So you can keep lying to me? So you can keep sneaking around behind my back with her?" Tim raised his hands in a placating gesture, stepping slightly in front of Jessica, as if to shield her. "You're not thinking clearly, Sarah. Just put it down, and we'll talk. We can figure this out." But Sarah was beyond reason. Her mind was a storm of jealousy, betrayal, and rage, the emotions swirling together into a single, blinding need for release. She shook her head, her grip tightening on the knife. "There's nothing to figure out," she said, her voice trembling with barely controlled fury. "I know everything. I know what you've been doing." For a moment, Tim looked like he was going to deny it again. But then he glanced at Jessica, and Sarah saw the guilt flash across his face. It was all the confirmation she needed. With a cry of anguish, Sarah lunged forward. It wasn't a conscious decision, more like an instinct, a desperate need to strike out at the people who had caused her so much pain. The knife slashed through the air, aimed at Jessica, but at the last second, Tim shoved her aside, taking the blow himself. The blade sank into his side with a sickening thud, and for a moment, the barn was eerily silent. Sarah stared in shock, her hand still gripping the knife, as if she couldn't quite comprehend what had just happened. Tim staggered back, his hand pressed to the wound, blood seeping through his fingers. His face was pale, eyes wide with pain and disbelief. "Sarah," he gasped, collapsing to his knees. What have you done?" Jessica screamed, rushing to Tim's side, her hands shaking as she tried to apply pressure to the wound. Blood pooled around them, dark and thick on the barn floor. Sarah stumbled back, the knife falling from her hand. Her mind was blank, the reality of what she had done not fully sinking in. She had wanted to hurt them, to make them pay for what they had done to her, but she hadn't meant to. She hadn't meant to. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of Jessica's sobs. "Oh my God, what have I done?" The moments after the stabbing were a blur of panic and confusion. Sarah stood frozen, unable to move, her mind struggling to catch up with the gravity of what had just happened. Tim was dying. The realization hit her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She had stabbed her husband. Her hands were covered in his blood. Jessica's frantic voice broke through the haze. "Call 911. We need to get him to a hospital." Sarah blinked, her body moving on autopilot as she fumbled for her phone, her fingers slick with blood. She dialed the number, her voice shaking as she spoke to the operator. But the words felt distant, unreal. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. Tim was gone, his body lying limp in Jessica's arms, her tears mingling with the blood on his shirt. The paramedics tried to revive him, but Sarah knew it was pointless. The damage had been done. The police arrived shortly after, and Sarah was taken into custody. She barely registered the questions they asked, her mind numb with shock. All she could think about was Tim's face in those final moments, the look of pain and betrayal in his eyes as he bled out on the barn floor. The trial was quick. Sarah pled guilty to manslaughter, though her lawyer tried to argue that it had been an accident, a crime of passion fueled by emotional distress. The court didn't buy it. The evidence was clear. Sarah had gone to the barn that night with the intention of confronting Tim and Jessica, and in the heat of the moment, she had stabbed him. The prosecutor painted a picture of a woman consumed by jealousy, driven to violence by her own insecurities. The texts between Tim and Jessica were presented as evidence, but they were inconclusive, suggestive, yes, but not definitive proof of an affair. Jessica testified, tearfully recounting the events of that night, but even she couldn't confirm whether Tim had ever actually been unfaithful. In the end, it didn't matter. Sarah had killed her husband, and the court found her guilty. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison. In the months that followed, Sarah tried to make sense of what had happened. She replayed that night over and over in her mind, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when everything had gone wrong. Was it when she had first suspected the affair, when she had found the texts, or had it been earlier, when her marriage had started to unravel in ways she hadn't even noticed? From her cell, Sarah received letters from her children. They were confused, heartbroken, unable to understand why their mother had done what she did. She tried to explain, to make them see that she hadn't meant for any of this to happen, but the words felt hollow, inadequate. How could she explain the madness that had consumed her, the jealousy that had driven her to take Tim's life? Jessica left the farm not long after the trial, moving to another state to escape the memories of that fateful night. She would always be tied to the events of the barn, a ghost that haunted Sarah's thoughts even behind bars. The truth was, no one would ever know if Tim had truly been unfaithful. Whether or not there had been a real affair between him and Jessica didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that Sarah had believed it, and that belief had destroyed her life. She sat in her cell every night, staring at the cold, gray walls, knowing that no amount of remorse or regret could ever change what she had done. Tim was dead, and she was responsible, and for the rest of her life, that guilt would be her only companion.